Ja, vielleicht auch zu viel.
Aha, hier sehe ich's.
Aber hier sehe ich nichts.
All right. Ja. Okay, perfekt. Ja.
Der Klicker, gucke ich mir noch an.
Klicker.
Wahrscheinlich ist die Batterie alle.
Warte, sonst kann ich mal schnell gucken.
Nee, du kannst auch einfach hier auf
Ja.
die Tastatur drücken.
Okay.
Ja, sonst kann ich dir aus der Fernbedienung rausholen, wenn du willst.
Okay, I'm just gonna start for now. All right, welcome to the Berlin Prometheus, May 2025. I'm getting a call. Nope. That's actually my mom calling. What the hell? All right, so yeah, welcome to this month's edition. Last one was 3 months ago at Trade Republic. This time around, thankfully hosted by SysEleven. Thank you for organizing everything in terms of drinks and food, and yeah, for having us. I'm Matthias from Polar Signals organizing this, and since we are a CNCF meetup, also CNCF is sponsoring some part of all of this and doing the registration, etc. So, I don't know, big round of applause for SysEleven. We have 2 talks. The first one is by Björn on the metadata in Prometheus, which is going to be very interesting because I think there's been some developments in the recent past and potentially more in the future. And then the new website by Julius, who isn't paying attention because he's like still hacking away on the new website.
You told me yesterday to give a talk.
Yeah, so let's see, but Should be fun. And the next meetup, we don't yet have it scheduled. So in that case, please follow us on Twitter thing if you need to. But we also have a Blue Sky for now, and maybe a Mastodon, whatever in the future. So you can follow us on the socials to get more information on the next meetups, and obviously like register through the CNCF page, and then you get the email, I think. Did you get an email for like the publishing? Okay. Okay, so that should work as well. More contacts on like how you can find Prometheus and how you can follow and that kind of stuff. And enjoy. And for a couple of minutes, Simon wants to tell us about SysEleven.
Thank you, Matthias. So hello, my name is Simon Pierce. I work for SysEleven. We're super happy to be hosting the Prometheus meetup this evening. We're a managed hosting provider from Berlin. We do a lot of cloud hosting, primarily on OpenStack. And on our OpenStack cloud, we build Kubernetes clusters. So if you're interested in managed Kubernetes, definitely the right spot. And if, of course, anyone's interested about talking about anything we do tonight, please feel free to talk to me, or there's a few of my colleagues at the back, and there's also someone from HR, Miller, here tonight. And if you're interested, of course, in any of the openings that we may have, we're also hiring, so please feel free to reach out and to talk to us. Yeah, so let's get going with the first talk.
Okay.
Do you need this?
Now I have one
yeah,
here.
Okay, back to Matthias.
This is also on, right? But I don't even think I need that, right? If we were like full of people, it's nicer to stand here. And then I cannot move around. So, but where's the slideshow button on this? It existed here. Why is this not working? What?
Maybe the arrow can give us more tools if we click on it.
Oh. Weird. I mean, I could say things about how Google works and how you get rewarded for pushing new feed, but I shouldn't. It's all streaming now. State of metadata in the Prometheus ecosystem. I'm famous for favorite topic being histograms, so I created native histograms, and that's kind of history by now. And then people ask me, what's the next big thing in Prometheus? And I kind of thought metadata is the next big thing, what we need. It's a bit like OTel in use, I guess, but it's also something we really talked about it from the beginning. Like the real person from the beginning, Julius, is sitting there, so he can always tell me if I'm lying, but some things were really there from the beginning. I haven't given a talk in such a long time that my clicker has run out of battery, so I even have to stand here anyway. Okay, so as you might know from other talks, I love the Greek stuff, right? So meta is, of course, Greek. It's a preposition and it means after or beyond. Metaphysics is like beyond physics, but probably not for the reason you think now, but anyway, like data. What is beyond data, or what comes after data? So yeah, it's a bit weird. Data, time series. What is a time series? It's a series of time-stamped values. The values are floats traditionally, and whenever it's yellow, it's like a little bird that tweets something. Only floats, because of course histograms, but we might talk about that later. But that's the traditional view, right? So you get floating point values at a certain timestamp, and you have a number of them. That's a time series, that's the data, and everything else is metadata, right? That's kind of the really classical idea. So labels are metadata. And the metric name is anyway just a special label, right? If you know how Prometheus works internally. So that's metadata. I need my drink. This is, by the way, I've seen this, like people explaining Prometheus. Prometheus has metadata, the labels, right? So that sounds weird to old Prometheus people because we never thought about labels as metadata. Strictly speaking, that might be metadata, and it's just a sign for like people have very different understanding of what metadata actually is. So you could totally argue labels are metadata, but in the classic Prometheus sense, it's something else, and it all comes from the exposition format, because that was kind of, I mean, Matt Proud once told me the whole idea started with the exposition format, with the data model, and there is still this kind of weird dissonance that the data model of the exposition format is not exactly the data model that is used in the Prometheus server. But let's go back to the exposition format, and I'm also bending the truth here a bit because I used Open Metrics version 1, which didn't exist, of course. When Prometheus came out, Prometheus even didn't have a text format back then. It had the protobuf format is really old, but it also had a JSON format. This nice trivia question when you ask about this. We had this in the trivia quiz, right? The JSON. Anyway, so I'm just using the modern quote-unquote format here to not confuse you, but it's bending the truth a bit. And the orange parts, that's what is in as a comment. That's what classically is the metadata in Prometheus. So the actual data is the name, the labels, and the value. There's no timestamp yet because the timestamp only gets created when you scrape, or you might provide it in the exposition format, but even that was a later idea. And this help, type, and unit is also newer, but help and type traditionally, but it's all done in the same way. That's what is traditionally considered metadata. And as you can see, even if you have different metrics down here with different labels, the metadata is per label name. So all node CPU seconds metrics have the same metadata. So it's per metric name. There's also this term metric family, which you might have heard, which is nice because if you are a family, you have the same name, right? But that's also a very traditional view. Like today, families might not have this, whatever. So family name was probably more confusing than it helped. So metadata is per metric name. And it's also, that's not obvious from here, it's per target, because this is an exposition that comes from one target. Another target might have a very different idea of the help string of node CPU seconds. It might even think it's a gauge, which would be wrong, right? But who knows, right? So it's only true per target. There was also this idea, this is non-identifying data. It doesn't so the series is identified by the labels, including the name. But that's already not super true because these underscore total is a suffix that should tell you, not strictly, but mostly, that this is a counter. And I just said it's not identifying, but the name is identifying. The unit should be in the label name. So again, the label name is identifying, so the unit is maybe identifying. And Open Metrics even enforces that. If you provide a unit string here, then it must be in the name, otherwise it's not valid Open Metrics version 1, which has also created some confusion, but that's a different topic. So this non-identifying was never completely true. Okay, but the weirdest thing is that the Prometheus server, for a long time, just threw this data away. That was metadata. It was helpful in the exposition format. That's also where this is coming from, because in the old Google days with Borgmon, people had an endpoint that was also text format, but it had no metadata at all, and it was always this kind of guessing. So we wanted this in the exposition format, but the Prometheus server initially, it was an MVP, right? So, but then it became very famous. It was still an MVP, but so for a long time there was no real treatment of metadata. And then the first attempt to deal with it was to provide a metadata endpoint. So this is completely separate from PromQL. There's a separate API endpoint, which is targets/metadata, because it's per target. And you can read it up in the documentation what it does. You can essentially ask for specific targets. You can also get all the metadata. And you also can ask for a specific metric name. You can limit it, okay. But then you gets this unit, type, and help metadata back, but you get it per target. And that's a bit weird because target is not a first-class concept. Like the metric essentially forgets what target it belongs to. In principle, it's encoded in the labels, but all labels are equal, right? So you cannot see, if you look at a metric, what the target's label are. You really have to go back and see how you have configured the target, what are the target labels, and then you could deduce what the target is. So that was a bit weird. One of the primary use cases was that a UI could give you tooltips. This is a counter, or it could display you the help string. But the UIs got really confused because they had to ask for a specific target. So that was already a bit weird. And another thing is there's no history in here. This is only displaying the current state, which is from the scrape cache, so the latest scrape essentially. If a whole target disappears, which happens all the time, essentially it goes after a while, it's not in the scrape cache, so you cannot ask for the metadata anymore. If a metric has been completely renamed and you have it in your dashboard still from last month, you get no metadata. So second attempt was just an incremental improvement, or maybe it made things worse because this whole target information was weird. So let's just display things without a target, but that means it's now ambiguous, right? So you have to display all the different help strings that different targets might have shown you. So this gives you a multiple number of metadata sets for a metric name. It was a bit easier for like Grafana to display stuff, but it also essentially just emphasized the problem. So multiple help strings for the same metric. Okay, so after a while, there was some realization. I think it was a realization some people might still object and say it's not true, but I think by now we all have agreed metadata, even if sometimes it's not meant to be per series, not per metric name, but per individual series, we kind of have to increase the resolution to that level to cover the use cases, essentially. So it's definitely like the classical metadata is shared between a number of series, but modeling that would require a more sophisticated data model, I guess. So it's per series is probably much better. And we should also store it historically. So you can still see my metric from last month still exists, and I can still see that it's a counter and had a certain help string. Yeah, it should all be more integrated, right? And then the little bird tells me, what about recording rules? Because nobody has ever set any type or help string on a recording rule. That's probably a good idea, right? I mean, a recording rule that also tells you a help string. If you look at the result of a recording rule in a UI, you want to see a help string. Nobody has thought about this yet. Maybe, or not nobody, but nothing has happened on that front. Okay, there are also more kinds of metadata than just the classical thing, right? So you could say labels are metadata anyway, but even if you say except labels are not metadata, there is this thing where label sets are shared by many series, but not needed for identification. And that's when people started to say, okay, I want to see the software version of the target that produced this metric. And then you could attach it to every single metric. And then somebody said, it's kind of noisy, so let's create a build info metric. And that was when the info metric was born, which is, it's a first-class citizen in Open Metrics, but it's not really a first-class citizen in Prometheus. And that's the use case where, like, essentially you want a bunch of information on every metric. Metadata, kind of, the name makes sense. And it's shared, it's actually not identifying, like if you, I mean, often in the cloud native world, if you restart something, it gets a new port ID and stuff, and then it's also a new series. But you could have, like, let's say, a static conventional MySQL server that you just restart with a new software version, then you would even have the same metric, but it has now a different software, like a different, whatever, a Git hash or software, release identifier or something, right? So this use case works, and it's modeled via this info metric. I'll talk about it a bit more later because it has some issues. But anyway, so another thing that I always liked a lot is series lifecycle. When does the series start? When does it end? what scrape interval. You could look at the actual interval, but maybe you want to know what's the intended scrape interval. That's all metadata. We have this created at timestamp now. That's metadata, but it's very different metadata. Yeah, and then OTel entered the stage, right? This young, weird project that for some reason everyone talks about. Okay, so they have a very rich data model, right? So, and there are resource attributes, there's now even entities, and nobody understands it, but it's kind of metadata, and we want to model that as well. Okay, so why not create a quadrant, right? This is what you do, proper nerdy thing, right? So 2 dimensions, and I just realized this in one of the discussions that it might be helpful to look at metadata in this way. So metadata could be identifying or it's not identifying. We discussed this already. And then I put index and not indexed here. This is, I first said queryable, but I mean, that sounded like you cannot even query the metadata, but it's the direction of query. And not index means I cannot ask, give me all the metrics that have this metadata. Or I could maybe, but it's an expensive operation. And index means it's indexed. So this might make sense to say we have some, I should go to the example here. So the classical labels and the metric name are a perfect example for identifying an index, right? Of course, you query via labels all the time. So it's indexed. And it's also identifying, that's the whole definition, right? And it's arguably not considered metadata. But you could say we call a metadata, it's this identifying index type. And now the OTel resource attributes, they come into the game. They're kind of like target labels, but on steroids, and there are a lot of them, so we usually don't want to attach them to all metrics. And yeah, there are different ways of treating them. So they feel like they're not identifying, but they should be indexed. Like OTel has this, I want to see all metrics coming from a specific producer, and the producer is identified by the resource attributes, and then you want to query for them, but they're kind of non-identifying. The problem is in the OTel data model there are, although they in practice are not really. So that's why I put the resource attributes here, but in practice they're more here. OTel entities is then the real thing. That is this kind of metadata that you want to search for, but it's also for real, not identifying. There is still a bit of discussion happening in the OTel community. Infometrics, this is what we have in Prometheus as not quite a first-class concept, but this is where you have this index but not identifying. Like I can give me all the metrics that have been produced by MySQL version 1.2.3, right? That would be possible with a MySQL build infometric because it's all indexed, but it's not identifying, right? The series doesn't pull its identity out of the software version. Okay. So the non-index case is maybe more interesting. The help string, that's the classical case for not identifying, not indexed. I mean, I assume nobody wants to know all the metrics that have this specific help string. That would be weird, right? Also, if the help string changes because somebody realizes I should have a period at the end of the sentence, like we do in the Prometheus community, then I should not get like metric churn and all the metrics are now new. So that's a really nice example. This series lifecycle stuff that I talked about is also in this category. And now type and unit, they are super interesting. And you will see later why. And I said, like, this is not the Prometheus, this old kind of definition of not identifying. That's just not true, right? Type and unit are essentially identifying. Now there's this weird case if people don't follow the recommendation and they don't have the unit in the metric name and they have a counter that doesn't end off _total, so kind of doesn't become identifying in Prometheus, but it should, right? And also, you should really probably not ask for all metrics that are in seconds. That would be also a weird request, right? So you don't need to index it, but we kind of do if it's in the name, but yeah, we'll talk about this also later. But I think this is a very good thing to have in mind when thinking about the shape of metadata. Okay, now for the rest of the talk, I just go through approaches that are around or are being considered, and then we can see what happens here. So life cycle, I want to do this first because it's kind of the weirdest thing. The idea is here we utilize existing TSV mechanics, and the oldest one is the staleness marker, which is really esoteric. I still remember the good old days when Brian Brazel gave this talk about how staleness works, and like everyone, it was a PromCon, full house, everyone was sitting there like, I mean, I kind of understood it, but that was because I followed when it was created, but like, yeah, it was super interesting. But this is super helpful, the staleness markers, and they kind of encode the end of a series, more or less. Now we have a new concept for the other part, created at timestamps for counters, could also be used for others, I guess. It helps with counter reset detection, but it's also, it gives you, it pinpoints when a counter starts, helps with this problem where a counter never realized when it still had the value 0. And that's kind of a way how to encode a series start. And we are not quite sure how we store this in Prometheus. And the current experimental approach is to make up a 0 sample at this timestamp. So that's just a normal sample, but in a way we are storing metadata in a weird shape, right? But it's all not exact tracking of start and scrape. So the orange part is always concerns, right? This is something that concerns me often, that we have this weird lookback delta, right? This is the only parameter in Prometheus that says what is a long time and what is a short time, like, because 5 minutes is, yeah, it ought to be enough for everyone or something, right? But some people might have a very low frequency TSDB where they take a sample every day and they want data over 10 years or something, and then they have to set the lookback delta to something else. Like the TSDB, the code itself, it doesn't even know what the timestamps unit is. We use it as milliseconds, sorry, but there's no, like in the code, it's just a number, right? And I really don't like the lookback delta. And it would be great if we had a better concept when the series starts and ends, and we could just not use the lookback delta. So, but this is kind of one specific department in the whole metadata megacorp. The other stuff is more like the normal metadata. I talked about the info metrics, and here we have this, like Prometheus build info. This is an example for these info metrics, and it has a set of labels that are identifying, in this case, instance and job, which are also the target labels. And this means all metrics that have this instance label and this job label, they all come from this Prometheus server, which is running on AMD 64. It's built from in the head branch with this Go version, with this Git revision. This is how you get this. You could attach all these labels to all metrics, but then you would, it's kind of an anti-pattern in Prometheus where the label set is over-identifying. You want the label set to be essentially exactly the identifying set of labels. And this is just additional info that is shared by all those labels. So this is, the idea is utilize PromQL features to address the not identifying but index case. This works quite well if you are like a PromQL, I don't know, Julius, what's the name for somebody who is master PromQL user, PromQL lister, I don't know, a DJ of PromQL. So the problem is, first, kind of the good part that when OTel came along with these resource attributes, they decided, it was also collaborative, of course. So we create an info metrics called target info, right? When we ingest OTel, the resource attributes are all in the target info, which is a bit a dissonance because I said this is not identifying, right? So the yellow labels are the identifying labels, but in principle, all the resource attribute key value pairs could be identifying. I don't even know if this always works or only just works in practice. But anyway, that's the currently official approved way of mapping resource attributes into Prometheus with a target info metric, but the info metric is also used for many other things. So this doesn't work well if you don't have staleness handling, because if you change any of these, because you update your binary, then you get a new target info, because these labels are all identifying for the info series, right? This is where we are mapping a a shape of data into the Prometheus data model, and there is a bit of dissonance in there. Stainless markers make sure that the old matrix isn't queried, but OTel, if it comes via OTLP, it doesn't do stainless markers. And then OTel users are very sad because they get like double target info for 5 minutes. And a UX issue is that it's really, like the queries, they look really, yeah, very impressive. So for normal, like mortals, it's really hard to write those queries. People often said PromQL is just not very elegant and we should have a better syntax. But if you analyze it, there's actually a lot of information you need to do this join, and they have to be provided in some way, right? So there is an ongoing improvement. It's an experiment called the info function, where you have a specific function that does this join. And it's not just syntactic sugar. It's like there's a lengthy design document where you can read that it has to know what of these labels are actually those yellow labels, the identifying labels. The other are called data labels. And that's not stored anywhere right now. So this is still something we need to do. Open Metrics has this distinction, but it doesn't exist in any real implementation. That's kind of an issue here. So this is interesting ongoing work, but still a lot to do. So now, OTel resource attributes are as target info, but it's problematic for reasons. So another approach would be, and that's currently happening, there's a design doc, use labels for metadata that is identifying and indexed anyway. So let's just promote all the resource attributes to labels. Problem is there are a lot of them, right? So you get this exact anti-pattern, you have over-identifying labels, all the metrics have tons of labels. So the idea is here that you pick a subset that you want, so it's not that bad. And users seem to like this, but yeah, we will see. So it's a performance concern, you have a lot of labels, UX concern if you have too many labels. And it's a misfit if the data isn't meant to be identifying, or maybe you don't even want to index it, right? Because you just use it as labels. So, and then also pretty new with the design doc, we can, because we have realized unit and type are actually special beasts, and OTel is really into unit and type, and they even have this, that they have the exact same metric in 2 different units in parallel. It's a feature for them, right? So it has to be identifying, and there's an idea to create labels that are __, like internal labels, unit and type. So we give maybe future UIs the ability to display them in a different way, and we treat them a bit special in PromQL. In the initial approach, essentially we throw them away at the first operation, but they could be used in a smarter way. So this is all pretty new and not very mature. The indexing of type and unit, that happens because it's a label. It's kind of needless, but maybe it's not too bad. At odds with Prometheus naming conventions, because now people, of course, will say, node CPU seconds total. But if I have the unit and type as labels, why should I write seconds and total into the name? And then they don't do this. And then Julius is very sad, because that's an old tradition and good practice. And there is this weird idea to use the dot operator to access those labels. And then it looks almost the same. But yeah, I mean, this is all ongoing stuff. Interesting. It's also driven by OTel users. They don't want the label, the metric name to change at all when they ingest this stuff. So maybe that's a way to satisfy them. But at least some subset of people will be unhappy, because you cannot fulfill everything in one go. Let's see how this evolves. So very cool. That was a talk at last PromCon, a dedicated metadata store. And I really like it. There's also a design doc for that. Implement a dedicated metadata storage utilizing basic TSDB ideas. Like, don't change everything in the TSDB. Have these ideas. It's very elegant if you read it. You have to wrap your head around it. And this is essentially implementing the data model of the infometrics, but in a first-class way. So it avoids a lot of the problem. It's also, oops, is my time off now? Somebody's coming late. They wanted to avoid my talk, so they come late, and now I'm still talking. Anyway, this is also, the idea was to map OTel resource attributes in that, but it only works if they are not really identifying, or you have to use a subset of them where they are, whatever. It's not as easy as we thought. At the moment, this was, the designers, I think it's by Arve and Ganesh, like by, Ganesh is also super experienced Prometheus person. Arve is a bit newer, but like they had really good ideas. Had this talk, but currently nobody's working on this. And the rationalization of this is we have so many other approaches currently going. Let's see how they fare. They might also, there is now a lot of hotness around using Parquet files as the backend for Prometheus TSDB. And the Parquet format might be better to implement this. So let's wait if that gets traction and then implement it with Parquet maybe. And also you have to truly understand OTel resource attributes. There's like the closer you look, the more confused you are. So and I think there's also it's still an ongoing discussion within the OTel community. So this has to be understood. What's the nature of the resource attributes? Is this even a good fit? And I personally think the hardest part is how do you put this into good API and UI to access it, right? To not again have this, we just display everything as a ton of labels. But super interesting. Okay, so that was all the approaches. I collected a lot of links, all the design docs again. You cannot click on this until you have the slides yourself. And how do I link the slides? It's a Google slide thing, so it's a very long link. But I have this Beyond 7 Talks repo where I link all the slides for all my talks, so you can check it out. There's a 2025 file where you can. So this is what you have to type, and then you get the link to the slides, and in the slides you can click on all these links. Okay, I think that's it. Should we take questions or something, or we have a few minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, people are hungry already. I've seen we have dessert here, right?
I have one question.
Yeah.
About the metadata. Have you thought about adding metadata about access patterns for time series? For example, which metrics are accessed? For example, we have the problem, we have millions of metrics, but most of them never accessed or displayed in the dashboard.
Yeah, okay, I will repeat the question because it's probably not...
I think I got it.
You got it, okay. I don't want to repeat the question. So I have never thought of, I've never thought about this in the context of metadata in TSCB. I would probably, like my gut feeling would be you should use query logs and then use your logs processing to analyze that for like query analytics. Would it make sense to mark it into, maybe when we have, the fun thing is once you have like a flexible, dedicated metadata storage, I think people will come up with all kind of interesting use cases for it, right? This is why I always said we should not just think about the help string and the type. There's so much more that we could store into. And there's this Prometheus metadata use cases and workflows document, which is just like a brainstorming document, which lists a whole lot of use cases. And also this design doc lists like a use cases they had in mind. And yeah, depending on the shape of the storage, different use cases might be enabled or not. And maybe that's one that could be also enabled. Who knows? Okay.
Yeah, there's one more question.
Okay. You briefly mentioned about Parquet and TSDB, and maybe you can elaborate more why exactly, what's the reason behind that, and what's the advantages you would like to gain? What's the current state and what's the expected state?
Yeah, I'm actually not at the center of this. I just observed that like some of my Grafana colleagues were thinking about should we use Parquet, and then maybe they talked about it in one of these CNCF Slack channels or something, and then like, I don't know, 3 other people came along from different organizations said, yes, we have played with that as well. So apparently this Apache Parquet thing is so versatile or it's such an obvious thought that many people thought maybe we should store Prometheus TSB in there. And yeah, maybe it just works better. I guess it's hard to reach really. I mean, because Prometheus is so, like, this was all designed in a dedicated TSP just for this use case. And I still remember, like, when like the Julius, which version was that when you did this research, right, 10 years ago or something, where you tried out all kind of databases that were out there and nothing really worked. But Parquet wasn't around back then, so maybe it's really, like, it's a columnar storage format. It would be a more or less standardized storage format that you could more easily exchange. I mean, there are a lot of stuff. I mean, the hope is, of course, that it will be more efficient. And maybe more extensible, for example, for this use case. But yeah, who knows? I'm not at the center of this. It's also, I mean, columnar storage always is like a buzzword. I always claim that the TSP is already kind of a columnar storage if you squint, but yeah, maybe not quite, and maybe it really works better. And then if somebody optimizes this into the ground, then Prometheus would automatically benefit from it. All those thoughts are around, but yeah, we'll see. It's a lot of, how to phrase this, enthusiasm around this idea right now in different groups.
So did I get correctly that in experimental state at the moment?
There's no, like in Prometheus is zero code that uses Parquet, right? People are just trying, I think there's a Prometheus slash, I mean, whenever you look at Prometheus slash something something slash dev on the CNCF Slack, you see all those specific channels for people developing a certain aspect, and there's certainly one for Parquet. Like there's a group, they are meeting, they have meeting notes, and they are creating actual code, but nothing yet checked into a Prometheus repo.
Thank you.
It's very early. All right. There. You have waited until Matthias went away.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand the point about. Can you summarize what resource attributes, like in theory, they are identifying, but in practice not identifying? Like
Yeah, that's a good question because that's exactly what I'm trying. I just came back from vacation and I have a lot of tabs open in my browser. I want to read about this, like hotel discussions, hotel spec, and I guess the best equivalence is really the target labels of Prometheus. It's something that identifies the source of a metric or a trace or whatever, right? Hotel is for everything. And it's just a huge set. And I mean, my gut feeling right now is there was a design mistake to essentially say, you provide this n number of key value pairs and that identifies your target. And Prometheus maybe was wise in the beginning. There was this article on Brian's blog, Robust Perception, right? Which was something like target labels are not for Christmas or something, which was essentially saying target labels are super cool, but you shouldn't just attach a billion target labels everywhere, right? You should essentially think about what target labels do you really need for identification. And I think that was not the thought for the resource attributes. And in practice, what I mean, in principle, you identify a source by its resource attributes. That's as far as I went into the spec today. So a single one anywhere, a single key value could change, and then it's a new source. In practice, you probably just need the port ID, right? And everything else is, that would be enough to uniquely identify your source. And then everything else is kind of metadata, let's call it that way. And then this is probably how it works in practice, that you don't really need all of these labels for identification. But this is kind of fluid, and there was a whole long discussion on an issue, on a pull request in the hotel community about entities. And I think entities is what really models this kind of metadata. And there's now also a spec already, but this is not really in the wild yet. But I'm trying to read through this, and I think entities is what most people use resource attributes for. And in practice, a very small subset of the resource attribute is the actual identifying stuff. But only in practice, right? In theory, you could say, okay, the port ID is the same, but I have changed this whatever weird other thing. a vendor ID on, and then it's a new source. Yeah, it's a bit in flux, and maybe nobody understands them because just few.
All right, one final question, but we're basically ready for the break.
Ready for dessert.
Right, yeah, then, yeah, there are more bagels and desserts.
Okay.
And for the people who are watching, recording or live stream, well, you can't have bagels and drinks. Next time, join in person. Okay, we will be back at the top of the hour at 8. See you in a bit.
Thanks a lot.